O'Donnell escaped with only minor injury. A bullet grazed his thumb. But the first shots dashed his hopes of making peace. The show of force from the barges had released years of pent-up rage. Women and children were forced from the mill site, and the men prepared for battle. O'Donnell and the other strike leaders retreated to Amalgamated headquarters. With their captain down, the Pinkertons panicked. Despite the lull in the fighting, they made no move to seize the mill site. Instead, they placed Hinde and the other wounded guards on the tugboat Little Bill to be taken to a hospital in Braddock.
By the time that the Little Bill was underway for Braddock, the mill yard was a series of rifle pits. The bridge trestles and girders and heaps of scrap iron and half-open doors of the various mills and shops were filled with men skilled in the use of arms and bearing them in their hands. Not one of them, from the smooth-faced boys who seemed to prevail in numbers to huge, mustached old steelworkers who had drawn Carnegie's pay for half their lives, had any more compunction about killing a Pinkerton than they had about stamping on a mill rat. The sun rose gloriously, and from a distance the day was serene and quiet as a Sunday. Jack Morris stood up at the pumping station and looked out the window. A moment later, a Pinkerton ball pierced his forehead, and he fell headlong out of the window, and 40 feet below, his bones were broken on the shore.
Morris's companions carried him home to his widow. The sight of his shattered body sparked cries for revenge. Seeing the impossibility of controlling the situation, Sheriff McCleary wired Governor Pattison, requesting assistance from the state militia. Workers' votes had been crucial to Pattison's election, and he declined to intervene. By mid-morning, the strikers had witnessed so much blood, they were determined to make the Pinkertons pay. They fired an old Civil War cannon, then poured burning oil on the river, hoping to ignite the barges. The Pinkertons knew they couldn't hold out much longer.
We were penned in like rats. 4 times we put up a flag of truce, and 4 times it was shot away. And then we're crazy with fright, crying like babies. Those in charge were the worst of the lot.
A tall, brawny workman waved 2 sticks of dynamite high above his head. Men of Homestead and fellow strikers, our brothers have been shot down before our eyes by hired thugs. Yonder in these boats are hundreds of men who have murdered our friends and would ravish our homes. Not one must escape alive. As he spoke, he flourished the dynamite. A score of men raised their clubs and followed him. They were not savages. They were good, strong men, wrought up by the sight of blood and ready to take the lives of those who threatened them and theirs.
At last, the amalgamated leaders returned to the battle site. O'Donnell urged the reluctant crowd to accept a Pinkerton surrender. They agreed, but only on the condition that the guards be turned over to the sheriff and charged with murder.
It was a relief to us when we saw a man coming down the banks holding up his hands to us. He told us that we had better give in, and we agreed with him. As soon as it was announced that we would surrender, the strikers came down upon us. They took our money, our traveling bags, and our watches, and then clubbed us. We were driven ashore on the march to the town with something horrible. We were clubbed at every step. Sticks, stones, and dirt were thrown at us. The women pulled us down, spat in our faces, kicked us, and tore our clothing off while the crowd jeered and cheered. Our dead and wounded were carried on litters, and they were maltreated as well as the rest of us. I don't know how we ever managed to climb that hill and get into the jail, but it was a relief when we finally reached there. More dead than alive.
After a decade of Pinkerton victories, ordinary people had finally evened the score. But 10 men lay dying, and the outcome of the strike was as uncertain as ever.
The forces of the 19th century are capital and labor. United, they transform the desert into a garden. In collision, they convert the garden into a waste.
There was no celebrating in Homestead the day after the battle. Everyone expected more Pinkertons to arrive. McLucky closed the saloons, and the townspeople remained armed and vigilant as they buried their dead. The slain men were laid to rest on the hill above town. Most of the laborers were placed in unmarked graves. Jack Morris had been a member of the International Order of Oddfellows. He was buried in the Society's plot. Reverend McIllier gave the eulogy.
This town has been bathed in blood and tears, and it was all brought on by that one man, Carnegie's manager. He was the only man with little enough blood to do it. There is no more sensibility in that man than there is in a toad. Of what use can combinations of capital and trust be without the broad shoulders and horny hands of the toilers? These are the bone and sinew of the land. These are they that make its wealth and give it its prosperity.
The county coroner's office listed another 6 workmen dead as a result of the battle. The last to die was George Rutter, a civil veteran and a long-time union activist. At 46 years old, he had already outlived most of the steelworkers of his generation. There were 3 confirmed Pinkerton deaths, but the papers reported that a 4th man committed suicide as a result of his experiences on the 6th of July. The remaining guards escaped the Union's plan to have them charged with murder. The sheriff gave in to political pressure and put them on an eastbound train in the early morning hours of July 7th. Henry Clay Frick was conspicuously absent from the battle site. He remained in his office smoking cigars and refused to meet with the Amalgamated's president, who was ready to concede almost anything to stop the fighting. When Carnegie learned of the battle, he wired Frick from Scotland.
All anxiety gone since you stand firm. Never employ one of these rioters. Let grass grow over the works.
The events at Homestead prompted Congress to hold hearings. The Pinkerton Agency was already under investigation for its role in suppressing strikes. As Congress convened its hearings on Homestead, Pinkertons were battling workers once again in the Idaho mining town of Coeur d'Alene. Anti-tariff Democrats lambasted corporations for using hired guns to settle their labor disputes. One senator asserted that large companies should be looked upon as public entities, with the owners' rights subject to the rights of their workers. the iron and steel industry was outraged.
The issue has developed not into a question of wages, but into the recognition of whether the owner of works had himself subject to the law. There is no greater or more arrogant tyrant than organized labor when it is powerful enough to enforce its decrees.
Labor came out to champion the Homestead strikers. Workmen rallied in Chicago and New York. Hundreds of dollars in donations poured in. $4,500 workers at Carnegie's mills in Pittsburgh, Duquesne, and Beaver Falls struck in sympathy with the locked-out men. At the best restaurant in Homestead, the cook and waitresses refused to serve suspected strikebreakers. They walked off the job when the town became so crowded they could no longer tell who was who. Andrew Carnegie confined himself to the remote fishing lodge he had rented for $2,000 a week. When the press finally located him, he had little to say.
I must positively decline to enter into any discussion of the case. The news grieved me more than I can tell you. It came upon me like a thunderbolt in a clear sky.
In New York City, two Russian anarchists had been following the news from Homestead. Alexander Berkman and Oldman were certain that American workers were on the brink of revolution. They believed that violence was justified in the fight against exploitation. The events at Homestead were beckoning them to act on their beliefs.